1265th day of the war. There is a discussion in Russia on all sides of the society about compromises for the end of the war. Of course, it is impossible to say anything directly with hint and hint. Nevertheless, the New York Times, for example, tells about the Cossacks who convinced Putin to stop the war. Z-patriots also argue with each other. Those who are large, official, and as far as possible from the front say that it is necessary to fight until victory. Those who are close to the ground write that victory is not possible in principle. It is necessary to agree on what is suggested. Even television propaganda creates itself. Vesti released the plan of the end of the SVO, and Solovyov from the same holding says that there can be no end to the war. Moreover, he says that it is necessary to prepare for the war with Azerbaijan. Baku, in the meantime, threats Moscow due to the shelling of the Azerbaijani fuel infrastructure in Ukraine. Journalists write that Aliyev can shoot an embargo on the supply of weapons to Kiev in response to Russia's actions. Ukraine continues to implement kinetic sanctions and achieves more and more success in this. A record number of strikes were carried out on the eve of the Republic of Koma, which is 1,700 kilometers from the border of Ukraine, when the drones of the local oil refinery attacked. A reserve of oil with fuel was broken through. Local authorities reported a threat to UAVs, the evacuation of personnel from the enterprise, but they did not indicate which ones. This is the first case since the beginning of the full-scale war when UAVs reached the Republic of Koma. Tonight, an equipment building plant in Arzamas was attacked. In general, strikes on Russia continue, both on defense industry objects and on oil refineries. The defense forces of Ukraine have been liberated and completely purged from Russian occupiers the border village of Beslivka in the Sumy region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported this. In general, in Sumy region, Russian troops do not advance despite the many attacks. More precisely, they advance but strongly negative. A 47-year-old suspect in the fire of a relay cabinet on the railway in the Arkhangelsk region shot one police officer and injured many others when those tried to hold him back, reported the Transport Police of the Northwest Federal District. The wider and longer the war goes, the deeper it will penetrate the inevitable logic of any military conflict. About this and much more in today's fresh report, which you can support with your like, comments, and subscriptions to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, especially your subscriptions, which are important for YouTube algorithms. Well, you can support the channel financially on Patreon, the link to which is in the description, and by buying NVPN. This is a tool to bypass blockages that allow you to bypass blockages, watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, Discord, go to blocked resources. Now you have probably heard the conversation that the so-called operators of communication, or rather, they really said that the operators of communication of Russia asked to prohibit voice calls and all foreign messengers, but apparently it is let down on top of them, and such training and warming up to the prohibition of messengers across Russia is already very soon. In any case, without VPN nowhere, I offer you my VPN NVPN, the link to it in the description. There we have good support. We can quality fight with Roskomnadzor. It does not work out to block us. We bypass it quite successfully. In general, NVPN will help you with the bypass of any blockages, and in Russia it is still legal to buy VPNs and use them, so buy by the link in the description, thereby supporting this channel. Well, we are moving on. The parade continues with the meeting in Alaska. To be honest, the further, the more blurred it all is, not in the sense of some cunning overrides, but in the sense that nothing is clear and Trump somehow suspicions to come to them on the topic. But let's start with the Washington Post. The sources of the Washington Post confirm that Putin's proposal to allegedly leave Russia from the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions was misjudged by Steve Witkoff. Putin did not suggest returning any territories to Ukraine. He suggested the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass in exchange for stopping the fire. Nevertheless, even taking into account the wrong interpretations, Trump still agreed to a meeting with Witkoff. Then the post by Matthew Witkoff, who was given the CNN, began to circulate in the US. These are the conclusions from him, writes bitely. First, Witkoff admits exchange of territories. He heard what Zelensky said, but a deal is needed. Second, it cannot be a deal on which Ukraine does not agree, but at the same time Russia should agree on the deal. Third, Zelensky can come to Alaska, but this is not for sure. Trump will decide. Fourth, there are negotiations of technical commands. Fifth, Udikir has turned away from the answer to the question of Ukraine and NATO. Russia does not decide, but 32 countries of the members need to agree. In general, there are full quotes, but we need them. In any case, the post from the US to NATO is the last one who now has a point of listen, taking into account that in the White House there is no stopping house since Donald Trump went there. The possibility of his dedicated in detail is unfortunately about zero. Next, many began to discuss the new interview of J.D. Vance of Fox News. To be honest, he did not say anything very new there. Many fell for his comment that the United States no longer intends to fund Ukraine, but in fact he there described the status quo, the deal between the United States and NATO on the purchase of American weapons for Kiev. I saw a funny thing. In short, the Z channels who took this frame and made news from this, like they are so, here is America, that's it, stop funding Ukraine. They blurred it, when there is a Twitter about what this is about in the news, they blurred it. Why? Because in the Twitter it was indicated that it was about the deal between NATO and the United States. Yes, that is, J.D. Vance just described the status quo, when NATO and the United States agreed that the United States would sell weapons to Ukraine, and in fact, the money on this weapon will be allocated by various NATO countries. This scheme is already working, and in fact, there is nothing new in the words of J.D. Vance. Is it bad? Of course it's bad. Well, that is, if there were an adequate president of the United States who would allocate weapons to Ukraine, understanding that it is about the security of the European continent and, in principle, the question of possible future aggressions from different actors, for example, the same China or North Korea, which is now carefully watching everything that is happening and seeing that the United States has refused to support Ukraine directly with its own funds. Yes, despite the fact that if the United States supported Ukraine with the funds that Trump says, $350 billion, the situation would be completely different. The problem is that the United States spent at least twice less. In fact, if we talk about weapons, they spent even less than their own funds. So yes, of course the situation is bad, of course it's a pity that the degenerates of his team have the role in the United States. But the basic thing is that it has not changed from yesterday to the day before yesterday and to all previous ones. And it is better than it was at the stage when these degenerates said in principle that they would not supply any weapons. That is, the situation with the deal, it is better. Again, a short interview of Vance describes the Telegram channel to be, or, disclaimer, he writes. The interview was recorded even before Vance went to England, where they caught fish with the head of the Ministry of Britain, David Lemmy. I don't know what this changes, but after the meeting in Chining House, the sources of access wrote that a significant progress was achieved. And Zelensky in the evening address said that the arguments of Ukraine here emphasizes to be, or. It is about the meeting between the representatives of Ukraine, the representatives of the United States, and the representatives of several European countries, which passed in Hungary. So, the conclusions from the interview here bring to be, or. First is that, as a basis of regularization, they still want to take the current line of combat contact. The conversation was about exchange or exchange of territory. The second obstacle is Putin. He does not want to sit at the table with Zelensky. The third is that they want to plant Putin and Zelensky at the table so that they can decide something together. I'll put it this way, Putin cannot sit at a table with Zelensky. He considers it humiliating, but he needs to plant him. In general, this is what appeared in the last day. There was a lot more, but again, you understand yourself. The flow now is such that it is strange to pay attention to each army. Let's go through the positions of Europe. The current line of contact should become the sending point of negotiations. European leaders released joint statements before meeting Putin and Trump. President France Emmanuel Macron, Prime Minister of Italy Giorgio Meloni, Chancellor of Germany Friedrich Merz, Prime Minister of Poland Donald Tusk, President of the Netherlands Alexander Stubb, Prime Minister of the UK Keir Starmer, and Chairman of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen released a joint statement before the planned meeting of Putin and Trump on August 15. In the document, the European leaders emphasized that they consider the most effective approach, combination of active diplomacy, support for Ukraine, and pressure on Russia, to join the absolutely right approach. They came out for guaranteeing security for Ukraine and for the ceasefire or reduction of combat actions before the start of the negotiating process. The statement emphasizes the obedience of Europeans to the principle of independence, the change of the international border with force, as well as the unlimited right of Ukraine to participate in developing a path to peace. The current line of contact should become the starting point of negotiations, the statement says. European leaders positively evaluated the efforts of President Donald Trump aimed at the end of the war and expressed their readiness to work with him and Vladimir Zelensky for the sake of the world in Ukraine. In short, it is clear that nothing is clear. Again, all week until Friday, there will be some insides and most different ones. So far, everything looks like the United States roughly understands that even if you want to push Ukraine away, you won't do it on Putin's conditions. On the other hand, what is Kremlin doing itself is also not very clear. Putin himself hopes that he will be able to convince Trump to stop supporting Ukraine and refuse the idea to pressure Russia. What will happen to whom, we will find out soon if the meeting actually takes place, in what, as you know, I have some doubts, but, again, of a sensual nature, so I do not move them to the first plan and do not claim that the meeting will definitely not be. I just can't imagine. Putin in Alaska, well, kind of in Alaska, but we'll see. In general, by the way, it is much more interesting what is happening inside the Russian society. There is some kind of intensive eye-catching discussion inside Russia, everyone with everyone. For example, in New York Times, there was material that Dmitry Kozak suggested that Putin stop the war and limit the full power of special services. Deputy to the head of the Russian administration, Dmitry Kozak, this year called on Vladimir Putin to stop the war and start peaceful negotiations, as well as to limit the full power of Russian special services, writes New York Times with a link to the sources. According to the sources of New York Times, Kozak told his colleague that he presented an offer to Putin to stop combat actions and conduct peaceful negotiations. They added that Kozak also made it clear that he completely called on Putin to carry out internal reforms, including the strengthening of control over Russian village structures and the creation of an independent court system. And then, of course, it becomes very funny because the Putin system cannot exist at the same time as the independent court system, because as soon as the independent court system appears in Russia, Putin and his entire environment sit down immediately in the same second. So this is, of course, from the field of fantastic, but what Kozak could offer Vladimir Putin to stop the war is quite believable, and I will tell you a little later why. The proposal of Kozak will hardly affect Putin's position, writes the New York Times, surrounded by mostly people supporting his tough demands on Ukraine. However, Kozak's position reflects the disappointed part of the Russian elite and Putin's unwillingness to make compromises in the war and all the more controlled authorities of the special services. Kozak, born in the Kirovohrad region, was a faithful comrade of Putin at the time of work in the mayor of St. Petersburg at the beginning of the 90s. When Putin took the post of prime minister in 1999, Kozak became head of his administration. He also led training for the Olympic Games in Sochi and covered the integration of Crimea after the annexation as part of Russia. Before the war, Putin ordered Kozak to negotiate with Kiev about Donbass. As you can see, it went so bad. In December 2021, Kozak accepted an aid to the U.S. Secretary of State, Karen Donford, sent to Russia in an attempt to prevent a war, it is said in the publication. As the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, John Sullivan, wrote, Kozak breathed the smoke of his cigarettes with a gold filter in the face of the aid to the U.S. Secretary of State and published a long monologue about the evil regime in Kiev. However, among the Putin circle, Kozak is the only high-ranking official who openly says that he does not agree with the war, although he does not make this criticism public, the New York Times sources say. Kozak was present at a meeting of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which was held before the war in Ukraine and was shown on all channels. As previously reported Reiter, during the closed part of the meeting of the Russian Ministry of Defense, Kozak expressed himself against the escalation of conflicts with Ukraine. He also warned about the terrible consequences of the war, including the tough resistance of Ukraine, reported close Kremlin sources of the New York Times. After the start of the invasion, Kozak specifically stated that he had talked to the president of Russia about this, reported close Kremlin sources of the New York Times and the contact face of Kozak in the West, with whom the deputy to the head of the Russian Defense Ministry held several meetings after the start of the war. With some arguments, Kozak often said during these meetings. According to the spokesman of the New York Times, Kozak asked for ideas that could convince Putin to change the course. This position was worth almost all full power to Kozak, in particular to curate the relations of the Kremlin with Moldova, the Abkhazia, and southern Ossetia. Putin put another deputy, Sergei Kurylenko. A publication wrote about this in May. By the way, I do not agree with the New York Times, only in one thing. Kozak is not the only one in this position. Most people in the economic bloc, although not directly, are speaking out about the war stopping. Listen to the speech on Bulny and on Any Air. She emphasizes in the last months that state spending increases risks without controlled inflation and hinders the stabilization of the economy. The main state spending is the war. In general, the direct and indirect economic bloc often hint that the war needs to end. In fact, this is done by the Moscow Exchange. Therefore, yes, there are clearly such positions. They come from those who, let's say so, who generally want to live well, who want the Russian economy not to collapse, and so on. That is, those who understand the stupid situation and the coming down. They more and more openly say that the war needs to end, and it costs a lot in itself. Well, of course, what is happening is being separately discussed by Z channels. Not those that are official propagandists, but those that are a little closer to the ground in combat action. For example, the official propagandist Kots, who tells that Russia will fight to victory. And all this response is much more than a Z channel from the channel when the cannon was sung. I want you to understand me correctly, he writes. This whole over-the-counter rhetoric should not be at all. Russian military corps and journalists have already pissed off in 2022 with Kiev for 3 days, and it is they who have managed to win. Either it will be when the Russian army comes through. He quotes the position of the military corps and their reports of those days. It should not be in 2025 again, stupid Ganev type. If all the demands are not fulfilled, then the goals of the SVO will be achieved. This is just a mockery in the direction of the adequacy of the Russian population. From them, they literally make stupid people say that we are talking nonsense again, what have not yet started, he will better agree. First of all, it is necessary to understand what exactly fits into the idea of the SVO's goals. Judging by the fact that Vladimir Putin wants to negotiate with Zelensky, the regime, even without the past elections, is already recognized as de facto legitimate. They are not negotiating with the illegitimate. Secondly, judging by the fact that we see the SVO's goals will not be achieved, but there is a chance to survive at least something. The territorial question is obvious share. Contribution, Moscow will not go to this, but Europe can confiscate reserves and hand them over to Ukraine, which will already be considered as a contribution. The construction of relations with Kiev will be the most difficult process after the SVO period, and it will still come. It will be more difficult than even the SVO itself, and it will require huge political, cultural, and economic involvement. That's why I don't understand this, like, stupid Zelia gives us the opportunity to complete the SVO, hooray. Before I say that, for start, I need to look at the map, writes Setnik. About the choice of Alaska as a meeting place, I think we will talk to you separately. Let's say so. Many of the Z channels consider such a place for meeting Putin and Trump humiliating for Russia. By the way, Russian official propaganda also sends different signals. In the news, for example, they tell about the plan of the end of the SVO. Chances for peace: Putin and Trump on Alaska on Friday. What word did he say? First of all, this is not a joke. Report from Amboretsa: there are more than 700 tap unions with Russian roots in Alaska without their exception. What are your expectations? There's a great opportunity to build a dialogue. Why wasn't there a czar or a gensec in Alaska? We'll have a meeting with Russia. I think it'll be popular. The plan for the end of the SVO, signed by the president of Russia and the US, the presidents will discuss two options to achieve immediate escalation of the crisis. For example, head of the Russian Federation says that no war in Alaska will end there. Moreover, he threats the next war, apparently, from Azerbaijan. It's time to win. They pretend there's no war, just like in the society where you go out on Friday night to a large city. You think, what's going on? Does the war really end there? It does, and the war is terrifying, and that's something to understand clearly. And unfortunately, it won't end there for everyone. That's something to understand too, because the interests of Europeans, the war needs to end there. So even if Trump says, this is your problem, they will stay Europeans. So once again, we will have to explain to Europe who they are, what they are. It's fate that such a generation of Russian people are. But still, we need to understand that what's happening in the Southern Caucasus is a very big problem, and the Caspian may soon be in a position where NATO bases can appear. And if we consider Russia's position, it's so dangerous, it makes sense. And geopolitical positions could lead to such consequences that it could be not the last of our generation's SMO. So we need to include all sorts of methods of diplomacy to bring to all participants the fact that Russia needs to respect the interests Azerbaijan, by the way, condemned Russian strikes on the oil base of the company Sakhar and other its objects in Ukraine. During a telephone conversation, the president of Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Ilyakim Aliyev, and Vladimir Zelensky, the sides condemned the aimed strike on the oil base of the Azerbaijani company Sakhar and other objects of our country on the territory of Ukraine, as well as on the gas compressor station transports Azerbaijani gas to Ukraine, it is said in a press release of Aliyev. Zelensky also reported that he informed Aliyev in a telephone conversation about Russian strikes on energy objects in Ukraine. He called these strikes a target attempt by Russia to block energy routes that guarantee energy independence for us and other European countries. In August, Russia hit gas and compressor stations in the Odessa region. As the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine stated, this energy object was used as part of a route that unites Greek terminals of live gas with Ukrainian gas reservoirs through a trans-Balkan gas pipeline. It is supplied by the US SPG and the test volume of gas from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is also considering shooting an embargo on the supply of Ukrainian weapons and its own arsenal if Russia does not stop striking Azerbaijan's oil and gas objects in Ukraine, reports Caliber, as with a link to the source. So it is quite possible that in the foreseeable future we will see more intensive supplies from Azerbaijan, since, as you probably know, the relationship of Baku and Moscow is now, perhaps, at the lowest point in their entire history. Well, as long as Azerbaijan has not started to supply anything, it is necessary not to forget that the main thing is to lay down all this fight. The fight with the Russian fascist occupation army are Ukrainian defenders who every day not only risk their lives but also give their lives so that their comrades can live relatively calmly and are not captured by the Russians. Therefore, the support of the Ukrainian army is what each of us can do here and now, and what has real meaning, not all these endless conversations about what will happen in the future, what will happen at the meeting of Putin and Trump, blah, 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 what will happen to, but real help here and now. Therefore, I often conduct these meetings, and thank you very much for being actively involved in them. Today we continue the meeting for the 107th Brigade. I remind you of their appeal to you. To the soldiers of the 107th Brigade, the 97th Battalion, our direction is Toretsk. Our guys have been holding on to the difficult direction for many months. The situation is very difficult but controlled, and now we need your help in raising money for Baba Yaga and the compilers. Each of your hryvnias is important. Union until victory, glory to Ukraine. Glory to the hero. Here is the QR code for Monobank in the description. The links to Monobank, PayPal, Private, USDT, TRC20 cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin. Thank you very much to everyone who has already taken part in the meeting. It is going very well now. Half of the meeting is already closed. For Toretsk, as you remember, the direction of one of the most tough ones that is now available. And on a very important thing on the drone Vamper, that is, Baba Yag. This is a drone that allows you to do a lot of things and literally save lives and take the lives of the enemy, which also saves the lives of Ukrainian defenders. So thank you very much to everyone who participates today. I, of course, also participated and will participate in the meeting. All the links are in the description. Well, we continue. NPZ in Komi was hit by the drones of the GOR of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Drones of the main Department of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine hit the oil refinery. In the Republic of Komi, a link to the source was reported. According to the GOR, the NPZ supplied Russian army with fuel. As the link to Ukrainian intelligence writes, a reservoir with oil products was hit at the enterprise. There was a flow, as well as a damaged unit for the processing of gas and condensate. Earlier, Astra wrote that in Udi, the Republic of Komi, which is 1,700 kilometers from the border of Ukraine, at least one drone was attacked by probably the OO Lukol Utania in the processing of gas and condensate. There was no fire, but a reservoir with fuel was broken through. Local authorities reported a threat to UAVs, evacuation of personnel and enterprises, but they did not indicate which ones it were. This is the first case since the beginning of the full-scale war when UAVs reached the Republic of Komi. Reuters from Uktiv confirmed that no one is let out from the east of the city near the oil refinery and to the side of the airport to the street vendors, and those who stop cars and watch over them when entering the city from the west. Earlier, through loudspeakers, they announced an unmanned danger. In local channels, they also reported the evacuation of the TRC, Yarmark, which is not far from the oil refinery. In the real head of the Republic of Komi, Rostislav Galstein reported that there are no victims as a result of the fall of UAVs. Drones flew over some enterprises from which the workers were evacuated. He did not clarify which ones. Russian Air Force reported the close of the Udi airport. On the website Alukal/Dnipropetrovsk, it is indicated that this is the large enterprise for the refinery of oil, located in the Northwestern Federal District. The oldest oil refinery in the industry, is a 100% subsidiary of the structure Alukal. The enterprise produces including gasoline and diesel fuel. The plant's power allows you to refinery, according to different data, from 4 to 6 million tons of oil per year. But this is not all. Astra, based on photos and video materials, established that UAVs last night, close to the morning, attacked a massive equipment building plant, which positions itself as one of the leading enterprises in the defense industry complex of the country. According to SBARC Interfax, 20% of the plant owns the concern of the VKO Almaz Anti. In 2020, the APAZ was awarded the National Prize Golden Idea in the field of military technical cooperation. On Sunday, on the website Height, dedicated to the news of the military-industrial complex, a note appeared that the plant has acquired new equipment. The plant is under the sanctions of the United States and the European Union. The governor of the Nizhny Novgorod region, Gleb Nikitin, confirmed that the goal of the attack was industrial enterprises. As a result of the attack, one person died, another 2 were injured. Stay far away from Russian military factories. Serebryanka shared the analysis of the results of the strikes on the Saratov oil refinery, which apparently were very successful. Analyzing the photos and videos shot on the territory of Saratov and Arzamas, it is possible to make the conclusion that the strike was subject to the following elements of the Saratov oil refinery. Perhaps the AVT-6 system, used for primary oil production and is the key system of the Saratov oil refinery. The system for receiving oil bitumes from the riverbed on the territory of this system. The most active fire was noticed, which is seen in all frames. And the oil products base NPZ is located south of the main production capabilities and marked as workshop number 8, writes Serebryanka. So yes, very effective and effective. Russia dropped an air bomb on Zaporozhye. Strike was made to the train station, the hospital with multi-apartment houses, said the head of Zaporozhye company. 20 people were injured, mostly who were injured by medium-level injuries. As a result of the attack, 7 multi-apartment houses and a number of residential buildings were damaged. In the photos, instead of the strike, there are no signs of military equipment or there are no military strike. Another military crime of Russia within the framework of its terror tactics, civil population, and civil objects. Some Z channels write about the already burned out problem of fraud in the reports, which is going up, and the Z channel pays attention to the fact that it is used not only for propaganda, but also unrealistically. This kind of reports go to the table of command, which leads to monstrous consequences. Here, Swat, for example, the channel Bradipo Orgio writes, Patsons, he writes, now a lot of people are discussing lies in the reports. We decided to put our 5 kopecks because there is something to say. Look at the situation. They're sitting up here looking pretty in the reports, reading like, we destroyed so many of these vehicles, we took such and such settlements, and we know the real picture here on the ground. Half of these victors exist only on paper, and okay, they should be colored for TV, but on the basis of this chunipa, plans are made up, then the orders come to us. Let's go, say, to the place where it's supposedly cleansed and the enemy ends up buried there and waits. How many guys have been put through this, huh? Does anyone count? Especially when the commanders start believing in it themselves. They report one thing at the top, require something impossible from us, and then they're surprised why the tasks aren't being fulfilled and why the losses are so high. Yeah, because the tasks are being set based on some virtual reality. Every time someone at the top writes an extra 0 to the destroyed enemy's equipment or cleanses a 0 from our losses, someone's death lies on their conscience. And then for years they will study successful operations, which there were no real ones, and we will die for the decisions made based on fake news. In short, as long as they feed each other with tales about our independence, we will pay for it with blood down here, and no one cares about it, the Russian military complains. As for the front line, today we will consider it in detail. Konstantin Mushevez describes the state of the entire front, achieving the situation in all directions. Let's take a brief look at the situation on the battlefield along the entire front line. Persistent fighting continues along the perimeter of Russia's encirclement in the border of the Sumy region of Ukraine. Russia is trying to hold its position in its western part and at the same time advance to the east on average 10-15 engagements per day in particular. Apparently, the Russian army managed to push the Ukrainian units away from Novonikolivka, but the attempt to attack between Alexivka and Vorochin turned out to be unsuccessul. Forward units of Ukrainian armed forces fortified less than 1 kilometer from Alexivka and over time penetrate into the settlement itself. Persistent fighting continues in Unikivka. The 104th Assault Regiment of Russian armed forces seems to have given way to a counterattack of Ukrainian armed forces within the village. Their front units managed to advance in the village itself in the direction of the school park as well as west of it. Apparently, Russia, in order to increase its efforts in this area, began to fight in the direction of Unikivka-Rapovchina, a unit of another regiment which was previously in reserve. The obvious assault also actively counterattacks along the border of Novokonstantinovka and Konstantinovka in the north direction, trying to completely push the front units of Russia from the Ukrainian border on its territory. Thus, in the Sumy direction, the situation has become even. For 3 weeks now, the sides have not had any significant advance, limited by the change in the line of combat contact in the tactical zone at a distance of up to half a kilometer. However, it should be noted here, and the military building reports that the Ukrainian defense forces have liberated and completely removed from the Russian occupiers the border village of Bizalivka in the Sumy region. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. It is noted that units of the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment and the 24th Separate Assault Battalion were involved in the operation. It is also reported that during their actions, Ukrainian soldiers eliminated 18 Russian occupiers. As for the Kharkiv direction, here Russia shows an active west and east of the city of Volchansk, as well as in the west part of the city. In particular, Russian armed forces have accepted several attempts to advance the West Street, Zhelezhnodorozhnya, in the southern direction and break through the territory of the oil processing plant, also to the south. Russian army is also periodically trying to advance to the east of the city with small assault groups in the direction of Tukoy-Volchansk Kuter and in the direction of Zybin. While all these attempts to feel a weak place in the tactical defense system of Ukrainian armed forces in this direction are not very effective, emphasizes Moshevets. Russian armed forces continue to concentrate their main efforts on the bridgehead of the army of the northern city of Kupyansk. He managed in particular to expand the encirclement of his front units in the direction of Golubov-Gradkovka during several early days, when, obviously, the frontline assault groups of Russian armed forces had already begun fighting for the northern part of Kupyansk. Hiding these actions from the north, Russia is also persistently fighting to hold Kondrashevka, trying not to give the Ukrainian command to organize counterattacks along the road R, which would threaten the units that broke through to Kupyansk. In addition, it is obvious that another part of the forces of Russian armed forces are attacking from Platsdarm in the direction of Dverichnya and Putinikov, as well as Kamenka and Kolodiznya, trying to join forces with the forces and resources that are stuck in the Velikobrolux direction in the area of the village of Malevo. So far, it does not emphasize Moshevets effectively. As for me, he writes, the situation in Kupyansk direction at the moment looks quite threatening. Russian armed forces have very significant chances, at least to hold onto the city itself and to paralyze Ukrainian units and units' material and technical supply, which are defended not only in the city itself, but also to the east of it on the basis of the army. And apparently it is such plans that are being carried out by the Russian command. The Russian army has clearly intended to capture the entire Kupyansk district of the defense of Ukrainian armed forces from the north as deep as possible. Apparently, the units of Ukrainian armed forces in the near future will be forced to leave their positions in the Serebryanka Forestry to move beyond the Black Sherebets River, writes Moshevets. With the breakthrough of front units of Russian armed forces in the village of Torskoy and the fortification there, the further hold of positions in the forestry by Ukrainian units became a very difficult case, since in fact Russia has become as close as possible to the main line of material and technical supply from the side of the northern flank. Obvious, these units will move away to the side of Yampoli and will try to hold the enemy on the Black Sherebets River. In turn, the front units of the Russian army continued their attempt to break through, as in the direction of Askal in the direction of Lipov, Kharkivka and often Dup-Glushenkov, as well as directly in the direction of Lemon in the direction of Zelenaya Dolina Shandrizlov. They did not have any success. At the moment, it is obvious that the 20th Army of Russia completely slowed down on its bridgehead on the Black Sherebets River. The pace of its advance to Askal and Lemana is either minimal or at all zero. In contrast to the neighboring 25th Combined Arms Army, which is obviously very close to the full range of Ukrainian armed forces bridgehead along the northern bank of the Seversky Donets River in the area of Serebryanskoye Lestishevstvo. At the moment, it is obvious, writes Moshevets, the command of Russian armed forces on the Torets direction has its next task, to completely push the Ukrainian armed forces units from the area of Chervenovskoye, Katarynovka-Klybenbek, which is defended south of the reservoir Klybenbek. In particular, it seems that Ukrainian troops will have to leave the area of Chervenovka south of the reservoir Klybenbek and try to stop the advance of units of Russian armed forces on the border of Plishivka and Oleksandr Shaltina and holding the area of Delinya Balka. Ilyaivka, Berostok, Stepanov. Well, the main events in the Pokrovsk direction are developing in the northeastern Pokrovsko-Myrnograd agglomeration. Forward units and units of Russia are persistently breaking through to the Rodinskoye and Krasnoy Lemons, and at the same time actively applying a tactic of penetration by small assault groups, which is a very significant experience. They advance in the direction of Novgorodskoye Kucherovyad, that is, in the Dobropolsk direction. The obvious command of the group of troops center of Russia, feeling the possibility of achieving operational success in its line, significantly reinforced the 51st Army. Its main forces are practically acting in the above-mentioned direction. For now, Russia has not taken neither Rodinskoye nor Krasnoy Lemons, although it is actively attacking there, but it has an obvious success in the eastern Dobropolsk. Frontline assault units and infiltration groups of Russian armed forces are already located in the area of Kucherovyar, Novishkivaya, and Blitskoye. So, it's obvious that the 51st Army aimed not only to capture the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration from the north and northeast, but also to make as deep an advance as possible to the Dobropolsk. For now, fighting for Rodinskoye has been going on for more than a week. For Russia, it has a very bloody nature, emphasizes Moshevets. It has not yet managed to take control of neither Rodinskoye nor Krasnoy Lemons located south of it. However, what is happening north of this area in the direction of Dobropolsk causes a clear concern, he emphasizes, since the further advance of the army of Russia to the north, in fact, is capable of sharply worsening the perspective of defense not only, in fact, Dobropolsk and Pokrovsk, but also Druzhkivka and Konstantinovka. Russia, in this case, deeply envelops these areas of defense from the south. So far, Russian commandment is pulling its relatively thin keg to the northwest and has a slightly behind the back in this direction. It would be good to cut it off. Another question is if there is anything, the question of Moshevets is asked, because this is the tactic of Russian peonies, about which many have already talked. Unfortunately, there is still no reliable mechanism, or at least, we have not seen this cutoff of these very SHU pullets, call it as you want. Deep State reports separately about the attempts of Pokrovsk to slip through the DRG. The sabotage groups in Pokrovsk, they write, are about 30 people in total, from about 150 Ketsapos to the city. According to our information, the enemy formed tactical groups of 3 from Pokrovsk to 50 people in each. The goal of the action was to create panic and force the units to run away from the city, as it was in Solovyov. In total, the route from Solovyov to Pokrovsk took 14 days, 4 days to the industrial zone in Peshchanov, and 10 days. They exceeded the path from Peshchanov to the Street of Defenders of Ukraine in Pokrovsk. Thus, every day, the infantry from the enemy passed only 600 meters in the hope of not being discovered. The communication, water, and food provided dropouts from drones, so there was good coordination between the groups, and everyone knew about everyone. They used cloaks to cover up and hidden in accidental shelters. Diversants had route trackers who were to move along. About 120 people out of 150 people died from dropouts. Perhaps someone managed to survive after the injury. On July 19, the groups began a pull-up in Pokrovsk and do diversified actions. All this time, the search for remnants of the groups continues. This week, another part of the diversants gave up. Accordingly, the goals of this operation did not reach, although it brought a lot of problems for the Ukrainian Defense Force. Can it be considered a success? The plan, in which 80% of the personnel should die on the way to the place of execution of the task, they doubtfully write. There will be no more conclusions. Conclusions will show the time, emphasizes Deep State, but we are returning to the front. The front units and units of 4 armies, the east group of troops of Russia, continue their offensive at the junction of 3 regions, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporozhsk, writes Moshevets. Forward units of Russia have managed to expand their encirclement in the direction of Zelenaya Gaya and Vanovka, as well as Podobnaya Iskra. Russia is also persistently attacking in the direction of Myrnia Oleksandrorad and Voskresenka. January has a minimal result. Russian armed forces obviously were able to advance to a distance of about 1 kilometer south of Malovka. The forward units of Russian armed forces are trying persistently to capture Timirovka and advance in the direction of Shevchenko-Kavashevaka. They have not broken through to Kamishevaka yet, but the Timirovka, led by the separate assault groups, were able to bypass it from the south along the road to Guliapol. Russia is conducting persistent fighting for Malinovka for more than 3 weeks, says Ms. Shevets, but it cannot capture it completely. So it is also clear that Russia is very close to fully capturing Meshtu Riche, Meshtu River, Valkia and Mokrili, as well as Voron and Valkia, and to reach the borders of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast along the wide area from Ivanivka to Timirovka, writes Ms. Shevets. As for what is happening in the rear of Russia, a 47-year-old suspect in the fire of a railway staff on the railway in the Kharkiv region, one police officer was shot and wounded in the leg of another when those tried to detain him, said the Transport Police of the Northwest Federal District. Under this command at the moment of delay, the man resisted and opened a shooting. The suspect was humiliated and detained. The Transport Police clarifies that against the criminal case of the violation of the life of the employees of the law enforcement departments, the man is also replaced by an attempt at terrorist attacks due to the fire of the railway staff. As reported in the head of the intelligence comm on the Arkhangelsk region and the Nenetsk region, the shooting occurred on August 10 in the village of Kenosha, where a suspect lived. A man was detained, 3 police officers took part. In fact, this is the tendency that I told you about. When the dictatorship begins to do any action, any statement, any disagree with the criminal, that is, when they transfer absolutely legal activity as part of the illegal, then those who want to resist the regime, those who want to help the Ukrainian army and resist Russian aggression, they have the following fork. That is, if you change the price tag in the stores, they will put you in prison, and if you kill a policeman, they will put you in prison. Yes, so for them, on these scales, the difference is not big anymore, and therefore it will develop more and more. The longer the war goes, the longer the rhetoric of hatred is twisted in Russia, the more situations there will be with shelling and similar cases. This needs to be understood and meant. In Petrozavodsk, a military man cut his throat off a musician during a fight in the square. The man is dead. In Petrozavodsk, a Republic of Karelia, a military man hit a 35-year-old musician with a knife to the neck. The man, accordingly, is dead, the local media write. A company of young people with guitars took a rest on the boulevard Pobeda near the monument Titsa S.A. Chascha. A person passed by who made a comment. During the fight, a man from the company captured a passerby. The one who, in response, hit him with a knife to the neck brings the details of the incident to the local publication Factor. Later, a video with surveillance cameras was published, installed on the intersection of Moscow and Oktyabsko prospects. In the frames, it is seen how the man crossing the road, holding it by the neck. He tried to stop the car, but the driver passed by. As a result, a person who was spilling blood got to the gas station near the crossroad. Another car stopped behind the camera. The woman who got out of there called for emergency help and police. After arriving, the doctors took the man, and then he died, and the men who arrived at the scene of the police checked the marks of blood on the asphalt and grass. Local media reported that the man who hit the man with a knife gave himself to the police, but he was transferred to the military command since he turned out to be a serviceman. Later, an information appeared in the public that the dead man turned out to be 35-year-old musician Tiskamy and teacher of car school in Petrozavodsk, Vlad Nadolinsky. There were no official comments from the law enforcement departments at the time of the post publication, but in groups and publics, they write that the comment made by this passerby was in a quite aggressive form. Nevertheless, I emphasize again, any military man, any PTR man, hold on to something, they will kill you, they will abuse you, they will robbery you. These are absolutely sick people, in the sense that they, in principle, are not normal and adequate in Russia, but in the fact that there is no normal and adequate rehabilitation system in Russia. Therefore, they are simply dangerous for themselves, for other people, for the society in general. This is how it works, this is how it will work in the future. The peak of this will be when a bunch of people will return from the war, when hundreds of thousands of people, these TSM, will begin to scram and fight for the rest of the resources. Well, however, this is already a different story. I think we will still have time to talk about this in our own age. Michael Nacke was with you, and see you soon. All the best, bye.